A Life After April. Chapter 4. The Shape of Betrayal. Written by Gabriel Ndayishimiye. It was a quiet winter evening. The silence was thick, pressing against my skin like something alive, something waiting. The radiator clicked intermittently, the only sound in the room, a mechanical heartbeat against the stillness. Outside, the snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, muffling the world beyond my window. The hush felt suffocating, not peaceful, too much like the silence that follows an argument, like the pause between danger and consequence. Delicate, silent, too silent. The kind where the cold seeps through the walls, pressing in, reminding me of everything I wanted to forget. The stillness of the apartment felt unnatural, a void left in the wake of years of chaos. I had escaped, yet the absence of noise felt just as suffocating as the violence once had. It was in this hush, in this unbearable quiet, that the past came rushing back, unbidden, unrelenting. I was alone, finally alone. I had walked away from my second marriage, from the man who had once raised a gun on me, from the years of fear that had kept me locked inside myself. And yet, sitting there in the hush of that night, I was not in the present at all. My mind had taken me back to a different kind of fear, to a night in college when I first learned what it meant to be powerless. We were young, but not as young as we felt. We believed in our own invincibility, mistaking naivety for resilience. But invincibility is a lie told to the young, and we learned the truth that night. The illusion of safety shattered, leaving behind a world that was smaller, darker, edged with shadows we hadn't noticed before. There was no unlearning it, no undoing the moment we realized that nothing had ever really protected us. We moved through the world believing in our own invincibility, mistaking inexperience for resilience. But that night, the illusion shattered. In the space of hours, we learned that knowledge does not always come in the form of lectures or textbooks, that sometimes it arrives as a wound. And once you know, you cannot unknow. The world was no longer a place of infinite possibility. It had borders now, shadows that stretched into every room I entered. I had crossed a threshold I didn't know existed, and there was no way back. We carried our inexperience like a shield, convinced it would protect us from the consequences of what we didn't know. But ignorance was not armor. It was an invitation, an open door to mistakes we had yet to understand. We were expected to know the human body inside and out, yet we were clueless about the ways in which it could be taken, betrayed, rewritten without consent. The glow of the street lamp flickered against the frost on my window, casting shifting shadows that reminded me of the dimly lit halls of the dormitory. That was all it took, a trick of light, a fragment of memory, to pull me back into that night. We were nursing students, which meant we were supposed to know something about bodies, about consequences, about how things worked. But we didn't. Not really. Not when it came to men, to drinking, to the real world outside of hospital corridors and anatomy textbooks. There was a party, someone's apartment, a man older than us, by a decade, maybe more. He was in his 30s, which at the time seemed as far away from us as the moon. He had alcohol. We drank. Or rather, I drank. More than I should have. I don't remember passing out, only waking up, suspended between dream and reality, my mind grasping for coherence, my body already knowing the truth before I did. I tried to push away the fog, but the feeling of wrongness settled deep in my bones. Did I move? Did I breathe? For a moment, I wasn't sure if I was still part of the world, or if I had been erased from it. And then, the slow, creeping awareness set in, the kind that doesn't announce itself but instead seeps in like cold air through a cracked window. Something was off. Something was terribly, irrevocably off. The kind of waking where confusion sits heavy in your chest before clarity claws its way in. The sheets beneath me were foreign, their scent thick with sweat and something else I couldn't name. My body ached in places I had never noticed before, as if it had been used in ways I hadn't agreed to. There was a moment just before recognition set in, where I existed in a limbo of unawareness. And then, the world sharpened. And then, I knew. The morning light filtering in through a stranger's curtains, the sheets unfamiliar, the smell of the night before thick in the air. I was bleeding. I didn't know what had happened to me, not right away. But when I went to the bathroom, I knew. The other student nurses had left me there. Their absence sat heavy in the room, a presence more tangible than the man who had stayed. The silence they left behind wasn't just neglect. It was a verdict, an unspoken agreement that I was not worth saving. Perhaps they thought it was none of their concern. Perhaps they had learned already that speaking up carried its own consequences. But their silence pressed down on me, a weight that would not lift, a lesson in abandonment that I would carry long after that night. Their silence was loud, a complicity they might not have recognized in themselves. Perhaps they believed it wasn't their place to interfere, or perhaps they had already learned that looking away was easier than acknowledging someone else's pain. Their absence spoke to something larger, something beyond that night. A world that conditioned women to bear things alone, to be blamed for what was done to them. I was learning that lesson too in real time. Maybe they assumed I had chosen to stay, that I wanted to be there. Maybe they thought I had made a careless decision, one they did not need to question. Or maybe they had already learned to look away, to avoid the discomfort of someone else's pain. I learned something that night too, that silence is a kind of abandonment, that trust is not just given, but proven, and that sometimes the worst wounds are inflicted not by strangers, but by those who leave you behind. Maybe they thought I could take care of myself, or maybe they simply didn't think at all, too caught up in their own lives, their own choices. I don't know which possibility stings more. Maybe they thought I'd gone home with him willingly. Maybe they hadn't thought at all. I didn't tell anyone. What would I have said? That I was young and stupid and drank too much and ended up in a stranger's bed? That I hadn't wanted it, but it had happened anyway? That. I felt like something had been taken from me and there was no one to return it. Instead, I prayed. I prayed I wouldn't be pregnant. But I was. My parents were furious. Their anger did not protect me, it isolated me. It was not about what had happened, but about what it meant, how it disrupted the story they wanted to believe, the story where I was still untouched, still safe. Trust fractured that day, not just in them, but in the world itself. Love, I realized, could be conditional, and I was now outside its conditions. Their anger was not a question, but a verdict, swift and final. It was not concern, not sorrow, not even disappointment. It was fear wrapped in authority, a fury born of the unspoken rules that had governed their lives and now threatened to unravel mine. Love, I realized, could be conditional, duty could be cruel, and belonging could vanish the moment you became an inconvenience. I had always believed that family meant protection, but in that moment I understood it could also mean exile. Not just at me, but at the way my situation reflected on them, at the way it disrupted the quiet order of their world. Their anger wasn't about justice. It was about shame, about fear, about the unspoken rules that dictated a woman's worth and the consequences of stepping outside them. I had hoped for concern, for protection, for even a sliver of understanding. Their anger settled over me like a sentence already decided. No trial, no questions. The way parents always are when their daughters come home with the kind of trouble no one can undo. There was no discussion of what had happened, only of what must be done. A doctor, my doctor, said he could help me if I promised to stay in nursing school. As if my future could be bartered. As if my life belonged to the profession before it belonged to me. I learned that trust, once broken, is a grave you keep digging. You don't patch it up, don't pretend, it's dead, and you carry the weight of that death in every step, in every glance, in every goddamn breath. I learned that the world will take from you and never look back, that people will smile while they cut you open. I learned that love without truth is just a slow kind of death. I learned that silence is survival, both a shield and a goddamn prison, that some wounds don't heal, they just fester under the skin until one day you wake up rotting from the inside out. I learned. Lord, I learned. More than I ever wanted. More than I could name. I learned that pain doesn't ask permission, that wisdom is just the pretty name we give to all the hurt we've had to swallow. That a woman who survives in this world does so by knowing when to smile, when to bite, and when to walk away carrying nothing but her own damn self. Before that, my uncle had taken me to a doctor in Arkona, a quiet community tucked beside the Orsable River, where the roads seemed to stretch endlessly between Thedford and Watford. Arkona, with its unassuming streets and the hush of a place that time had nearly forgotten, felt like an odd backdrop for such a pivotal moment in my life. The doctor, after examining me, said he couldn't do it. A tipped uterus, he said, like my aunt's, the one who had named me. It felt strange knowing that something as small as the angle of my uterus could dictate my fate, could render me untreatable in that moment. It was as if my body had betrayed me, had placed me outside the realm of solutions, as though some part of me had been destined to be difficult, unfixable. I don't know why that detail sticks with me, but it does. A lineage of tilted bodies. I felt powerless, reduced to an anatomical detail that carried more weight than my own voice, my own will. It was a cruel kind of irony to have so little control over the body I was supposed to understand. It connected me to my aunt in a way I never considered before. Her body, my body, both carrying the weight of something neither of us had chosen. I wondered if she had ever felt powerless in the same way, if she had ever looked at herself and thought about all the things she could not control. Did she feel the same frustration, the same helplessness when she learned? Did she see it as a curse, an omen, or just another part of being a woman in a world that dictated what her body could and could not do? I wondered if she had ever stood in a quiet room, hands resting against her stomach, thinking about all the ways fate had shaped her without her consent. But it got done, somewhere else, by someone else. A transaction, a secret, a chapter in my life that was never supposed to be written. Afterwards, my mother was terrified. Another woman, a stranger, told her I shouldn't be so out of it, shouldn't be so lethargic. But what did they expect? It wasn't just my body that was tired. I think about that girl. She lingers, quiet but present, a shadow at the edges of my choices. Do I mourn her, or do I resent her for not knowing what was coming? Some days I want to hold her, to tell her she wasn't to blame, that the world is cruel in ways she couldn't have foreseen. Other days I want to shake her, scream at her for being so trusting, so unguarded. I wonder if I carry her with me, or if I have spent my life trying to erase her. But no matter how far I run, she lingers in my shadow, reminding me of who I was, of what was taken, of what I had to become to survive. I ask myself if she still exists within me, if I have carried her forward or left her behind in the places I no longer dare to revisit. Do I protect her now, or do I silence her the way the world once did? There are moments when I feel her at the edges of my choices, whispering caution, urging me to hold back. And there are other times when I fight against her, refusing to be bound by the fear she learned to live with. I wonder if I am still that girl, or if I have become someone else entirely. The choices she made, the way she learned to protect herself, the walls she built brick by brick. I wonder how many times she swallowed her voice, how many moments she let slip away, afraid to risk being hurt again. That night shaped her in ways she didn't understand then, in ways I still untangle now. Even now, in the quiet of my apartment, I catch glimpses of her in my reflection. in the way I hesitate before trusting, in the way I brace myself for disappointment. She lingers, a shadow in my decisions, in my reluctance to believe in safety. The one I was before that party, before the blood, before the morning light, before the whispered arrangements and the quiet fear. She was naive, yes, but she was also unbroken in a way I can barely remember. I was 12 when I became a woman. That was all. No fanfare, no shift in the air. But my mother called it something else. She said I had become a woman, as if it were an arrival, as if I had stepped into something irreversible. I did not understand. Not then. My mother said it like a fact, not a warning, though I would come to understand it as both. There was no discussion, no ceremony, just the quiet shift in how the world would see me, in how I would have to see myself. My body had changed, and with it, so had the rules. That's how my mother put it. But what she really meant was that my body had betrayed me. There was no celebration, no explanation, just the quiet acceptance that I had stepped into a world where my existence carried danger. Sex wasn't discussed in our house except as a whispered warning, a lesson wrapped in silence. I learned that silence could be just as instructive as words, that absence could shape understanding just as much as presence. In the hush, I was left to piece together meaning from the way my mother averted her eyes, from the unspoken rules about what good girls did and didn't do. It taught me that my body was something to be managed, something dangerous, something that could bring shame if I wasn't careful. Silence was not ignorance, it was discipline, a form of control passed down through generations. Men don't care what you look like, my mother said, only that you are there. I didn't understand then, but I learned. In the way eyes lingered too long, in the way silence carried expectation, in the way doors closed behind me. Learning wasn't a moment. It was a series of realizations, each one heavier than the last, each one stripping away something I could never get back. Not in words, but in the way the world looked at me. In the weight of unspoken rules, in the knowledge that safety was a fragile illusion. And then I went on. What else was there to do?